So it's a great pleasure, Peter, to be talking to you again after all these years.
Yes.
You were one of the first figures I met in our faculty, and
really?
One of the few I never had any arguments with, as I recall. So it's a great pleasure to see you, and an honour to be interviewing you. Peter, could we just start with your childhood? Can you tell me something about your family and your family background?
Yes. I was born on the 27th of March 1929 in a tiny village called Tilney St Lawrence in the Norfolk Fen, where my father had a small grocer's shop. And he had it there because he came from a family of small-time grocers. My grandfather was a small-time grocer in the East End of London, in various places in the East End of London, from the late 1870s onwards, although he was from the Fen too, from the Cambridgeshire Fen. And he married a girl from Huntingdonshire. But they moved to London partly because of the agricultural depression of that time and set up in a very small way in the East End. And he was a ship's chandler too for a time. They had a very large family, 11 children, 9 of whom survived into adulthood, and my father was the youngest survivor. He was the 10th. He had a rough time in the First World War, a really rough time, and he hit the bottle, essentially. And he came back to being a grocer again with his father, but because of the bottle problem, my grandfather, with the help of Lipton's of all people, because he'd worked for Lipton's, found this place, this little shop in Tilney, and set him up there in 1925. Well, of course, it didn't really work because my father tended to drink the profits. There was a pub across the road, and I'd been to the place, and although it's no longer a shop, it's a house, private house. There's still a pub across the road, as it were. Anyway, my father married my mother in 1927. She came from Lakenheath in Suffolk, where there were and still are a lot of Gathercoles, actually. So all my roots are East Anglia, one way or another. And they were successful for a time. But I was the only child. My mother had 4 miscarriages. And I was born at home, and I was a 7-month baby. And I was lucky to survive. But then the slump came, and of course my father went bankrupt. And eventually we moved back to London, and I grew up in Ilford. Barkingside, first of all, in a council house, and then in Ilford. My father was still in grocery at that time, but he went into various jobs. He had a very, very unhappy 30s, and I had a lot of unhappiness as a child because of my father drinking. And I went to Gathercole Council School in Seven Kings, and I thought I would be destined for, going for a county scholarship, because I was bright. But it wasn't unusual in that. I mean, we had classes of 48 kids, I remember. And by the time I got to the Gathercole Middle School, I was moving in a certain direction, obviously, though not very conscious of it. But the great thing was, my eldest uncle was a musician. All the family were very musical. But Uncle John was an organist and a cricketer and a butcher. And he had two butcher's shops near Wanstead Flats. It's all East London, all this, you know. The men used to talk about East London interminably and so on. The women did all the cooking and the washing up, and on Sundays they all got together, and the men talked about grocery and so on and so forth. Anyway, my uncle heard me singing to my grandmother at Christmas 37, because she was ill in bed in the house they lived in Ilford. And he said to my mother, "The boy's got a voice. Put him in for the choir school." And there was only one choir school as far as Uncle John was concerned, and that was St Paul's. Because he used to go to London to the meat market, you know, And then he would go to the cathedral, and he was a friend of the organists and sub-organists, and he used to be allowed sometimes to sit in the organ loft. And I remember him talking about this. You know, he used to talk about the organ as if it was something terribly special, which it was. He would talk about the 64-foot. He said it was a groan, a grunt. And he was a very interesting man. He encouraged me enormously. And so in the summer of '38, they put me in for the supports choir. And I failed, but they gave me another go. And in the December, I got in. I was the junior boy. I was number 38. There were 38 boys. So I started in January '39, the lowest of the low, in the choir school. Well, I was musical, but I couldn't sight read. I've always been bad at sight reading. And that really changed everything, because I was away from home in a boarding school, in a tiny boarding school right in the city of London, you see, with masses of music, which was fabulous, and actually good teaching too. And then the war.
Any particular teacher?
Pardon?
Do you remember any particular teacher?
I remember the headmaster very well, called Jessup Price. He was a mathematician, and he was very kind to me. He was a good headmaster. He was from Manchester. I remember he smoked a lot. Eventually it killed him. But he was good in helping the boys, giving them a good education, and so on and so forth. Yes, I remember another man called Vickery, I think. When he was sick after the war, I stood in for him for a time as a school teacher, teaching at the high school. I was 17 at that point, waiting to go into the army, you know. Anyway, we were evacuated to Truro, to the cathedral school. And of course we had a completely different life there, because we didn't have so much singing, we didn't have so many services by any means, and we joined in with the Truro Cathedral Choir on the Sundays. But that began my association with Cornwall. But my father had been in the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry in the First War. Well, they was Cockney. And he had an enormous feeling for Cornwall and for the people he'd served with. And he used to say, and I remember this so vividly, he used to say to me, "Peter, I was in a regular battalion. And if I hadn't been in a regular battalion, if I'd been in a Kitchener battalion, or if I'd been on the Somme, you wouldn't have been here." But a regular battalion was a regular battalion, you know, and the discipline was much tighter, and they knew how to cope with things. He was at Ypres in 15. It was dreadful. Dreadful. He was 19. 19. Awful. Then they went to Greece with that Anglo-French expedition. Anyway, I enjoyed it enormously in Truro, of course. Well, the load was so much lighter, you know. I mean, we sang 2 evensongs twice a week, and then sang with the Truro men and the Truro boys on Sundays. And it was really very simple in that sense. And it was not a bad school then. It eventually collapsed after the war, and they amalgamated with Truro School. I wouldn't say the education was brilliant, but then very little education was brilliant during the war because of people being called up and so on and so forth. I was promoted from 4th boy to head boy in 42, and that was my first experience of authority. And it was tough, because normally there was a system of when a head boy left, the next boy took over or something. It was very hierarchical. We had fagging, incidentally, before the war. They abolished that in the war. Well, how could you have fagging when you were living around in various houses in Truro, you know, and going to school as day boy? It just didn't work. So I was head boy for a year. And we still did a lot of music, and they put me in for the musical scholarship at Clifton, which was evacuated to Bude. A chap called Addison, who had been head boy before me, a very good musician, he'd got one, and so Jessup Price, in consultation with my mother, put me in for a music scholarship, and I failed. But I did very good written papers, strangely enough in mathematics of all things. You know how sometimes, Alan, you get a sort of verve, and you can do it. And I sat in a little room in Truro Cathedral, I remember, all by myself doing these written papers. I was, 14 and a half, you know. And they offered me a bursary. and my voice broke in the summer on a mid-B flat, of all things, during service. So I was useless from that point onwards. You could croak and groan and sing a falsetto and so on. So I went to Clifton in the September of 43, and they put me in the fourth form, but I didn't fit very well in the modern fourth, and I wasn't a classicist. So they then put me up into the fifth form after a term, and I took school certificate at the time of D-Day in 44. I remember it so vividly. And then I went into the lower six, and was moving to history, and then the upper six. And of course in 45 we went back to Bristol, and the whole regime changed, of course, because the headmaster imposed all the pre-war bounds and so on, and that's where I began rebelling. And the Labour government came in 45, and I rejoiced, although I wasn't terribly political at 16. But, if you were a schoolboy during the war, you felt very committed and very involved for a successful outcome of the war, I mean, I was 10 when the war started, but by the summer of 45 I was 16, and I was keen on the Cadet Corps because you felt you were doing something. And I remember we were away at a Royal Marine Commando camp in August 45. There was an old Cliftonian network that got us there, of all things. And then we were told that the war was over. The Japanese were surrendering because of an atom bomb. And I remember being very disappointed at one level because I wanted to contribute to the war effort. Anyway, that was 45, and then in 46 I was going up the school in the house in Oakleys, and I fell in love with a communist at LSE.
You were only 16?
I was 17 then.
17?
Yes.
How did you meet a communist from the LSE in Truro?
Now that's a very interesting question. I'm not sure that this ought to be made public, this bit, but it was a fluke. And she was 2 years older than me, but she was from Wanstead, Woodford, much the same area as I lived in, by chance. And she was a lodger in the house of the woman who was the secretary of the headmaster at St Paul's, Jessup Price. And her name was Kate Manifold. And she'd been here in the 30s, and she was a party member. And her husband, Manifold, was an Australian poet. I'm trying to remember his first name offhand, it'll come to me. He's a good poet, very good poet. And he'd been in Jesus, and he'd been in the party. And after the war, they set up in Belsize, just off the Finchley Road. And Jean was a lodger there. And I met her through Kate Manifold. And I got interested immediately in that circle. And it included, for example, Jack Lindsay, whom you will know of. Did you ever meet Jack Lindsay when he lived here? He wrote 160 books, I think, or something like that. I mean, enormously prolific writer, as you know. And a good classicist, as I understand it. And for a time, well, he was a friend of Child's. Yes. Anyway, I got interested in Marxism then, and I read quite a lot. And I started to take the Daily Worker at school, which was, of course, unheard of. Pardon?
Scandalous, I think.
No, the housemaster was very tolerant. It used to be delivered with his Times by the same newsagent. By that stage I was getting more and more critical of Clifton. But you see, I had to stay in the system because the only way to get out satisfactorily was to take all the examinations before being called up into the army. I wanted very much to go into the army. And so I ploughed through the History 6. And of course in 46 I could, because I was concentrating on medieval history and also into the 17th century, you see, Who did I read? Christopher Hill.
Did you? At that early age?
Oh, yes.
He'd only just started publishing, hadn't he? I mean, he'd written that thing on the English Revolution.
Yes.
That.
I still, published by Lawrence and Wishart, I still got it.
So have I, yes.
I got my copy.
Mm.
But you see, through John Manifold, John Manifold knew a lot of these people. You see, there was a very left-wing intellectual grouping in that part of London at the time. The Communist Party Cultural Committee was very active. There was a real network, as an anthropologist would now say, a la John Barnes, you know. And it was real and tangible, but it was also involved in music. And Manifold, John Manifold, played the bass recorder. And so he was involved in that enormous interest at the time in 16th century music. And Ernst Mayr, the German anti-fascist, in 46 published his book English Chamber Music, because he'd been working in the BM during the war. And I bought a copy. I've still got it. So I got to know these people, you see. Now these people were bright, they were very intelligent, they were iconoclastic, they were critical. It was a time when the Labour government was moving forward very rapidly in all sorts of directions, in nationalisation and so on. It was before the Berlin airlift, it was before the Cold War really developed, you know, before Churchill said there's a basic division in Europe, the Fulton speech in 46, and so on and so forth. Now, this all had a tremendous effect on me, obviously, but the contrast between meeting these people in the holidays and then going back to Clifton was almost too much. Almost too much. I used to write to Jean, and she used to write to me and say, now, come on, it's going to be all right, you know. Just stick to it. And that's where I learned. You had to stick to things, working within a system, even if you want to get out of it. So I took the higher school certificate in the summer. I remember I went rowing so that I could get to know something about Bristol, because you weren't allowed into Bristol. You know, generally you had bounds to guard you from women and booze. Yeah. But it's true.
Right, I went through it too, I know.
Yeah. And the most amusing thing was when I had to pay my bill for the Daily Worker at the newsagents in Clifton, I had to go 50 yards out of bounds. Anyway, I took the school certificate in the summer, and then, of course, inevitably, being a public school of that character, and it was a very good school in many ways academically, where did you put in for? Oxbridge scholarships, you know. So I banked on history here. And I got an open minor at Peterhouse. To my great relief. I was 17 and whatever. I remember Hallward, who I got to know subsequently again and liked, the headmaster. He must be near, if he's still alive, he must be nearly 100. He would have been a fellow at Peterhouse, of course, a classicist. And I was editor of the school magazine in my last term, and he didn't like the draft editorial I'd written. I didn't realise there was a censorship. The housemaster concerned for the school magazine sent it through to him, and he summoned me, and he threw the manuscript on the floor and said, "You can't publish this. What will the parents and the governors say?" Because it was too critical, you see. And then he said something very interesting to me, and I don't hold this against him because he was right. He said, "Gathercole, people like you should go to the London School of Economics, not Cambridge." And in a sense, he was right, you know. Anyway, I got a minor. Only a minor, someone said. Why didn't you get a major? My God, you know, to get an open major scholarship in history at Peterhouse in 46 would have been, think of all the history fellows in Peterhouse at that time. Incredible. I was interviewed by David Knowles, and no, I met him later, of course, Butterfield.
Oh, yes.
Fancy being interviewed by those two when you're 17.
Yes.
Butterfield said, do you tend to follow the economic interpretation of history? Words to that effect. Anyway, to my great relief, I got it. I got a scholarship. I left Clifton. I was going to leave Clifton anyway. and go for an Oxford scholarship on my own bat. I could have done that. There were some closed scholarships from Clifton, the Neil scholarships to Oxford, to Queen's, Oxford. And I worked in a bookshop, which I greatly enjoyed, and then I was called up. And I did 2 years in the army, which actually I liked. I did basic infantry training. I immediately got earmarked for army education, of course, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to be a driver in the service corps and learn to drive, you know. But I did infantry training, which was very good. Primary 6 weeks, and then infantry training with the South Staffs, which I loved, because I mixed with chaps from Birmingham and Dudley, and so on. And you know, it was hard, it was tough. And you help people along all the time. But it wasn't difficult for me, because I'd been in Cadet Corps, and I'd lived away from home. I lived in Spartan conditions in a public school, because when we went back to Clifton, you know, the conditions were pretty Spartan to start with. And then I went to the Army School of Education. There were masses of people going into army education at that time. The Labour government was very keen on army education, for good reason. Because so much education for conscripts during the war had been very bad, for boys particularly, moving around, you know, evacuated and so on. And 30% of the army conscript intake was semi-literate at that time, officially. So we did 3 months training at the Army School of Education, which was at Buchanan Castle in Scotland then. And when we weren't in syndicates, it was the Cambridge word that was used for group education and training, we were drilled by people from the Brigade of Guards. And this was deliberate. And the colours of the Education Corps were Oxford blue and Cambridge blue. I mean, you know, it was so typical, as it were. But it wasn't a bad thing to be in. And then I was posted to Egypt as a sergeant. The draft went out just before Christmas in '47. I thought I might be posted anywhere. Where I didn't want to go to was Palestine, because it was all breaking up then, you know. A close friend of mine was in Palestine, in army education, attached to the parachute regiment. And he had a very difficult time before they pulled out. But I stayed in Egypt, and I was at HQ, or GHQ, Middle East Land Forces, I think it was, at Fayed for a time, as a sergeant. I'd been at a wee place called Henare, where I hardly had anything to do, and the Brigadier of Army Education walked in one day and said, "What are you doing?" And I was lying on my bunk reading a News of the World that my father had sent me. I mean, there was so little to do. I said I was preparing a lecture. But then I got posted down to Suez as a warrant officer at WO2. I was a sergeant major. I was 19. I mean, it was ridiculous. But I ran that Army Education Centre until I got demobbed, you see, and it was a terrific experience. It was very, very useful experience. We ran these special courses for semi-literates and so on, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. We also did voluntary classes in the evening for regulars who wanted promotion, because the Army reintroduced education qualifications. We ran a library, we had a hall, you know, we did a lot of things. And I found that very enjoyable, actually, strangely enough. I mean, I wanted very much to see Jean, of course, and you lived a very Spartan male existence. But we were attached to an engineer stores depot unit, the NCO's mess, and it was the best mess in the district, in the garrison. I mean, you know, the engineers are great scroungers, and we lived comfortably, and I enjoyed it greatly. When I went there as a WO2, the mess president, who is a regular in the engineers, and they were all mostly regulars actually, and they were very good, he said, "Right, schoolie, mess treasurer." So I had to do 3 months as mess treasurer. It was awful. Anyway, it was a good experience. My closest friend was a regular called Scott, who had been, when a corporal during the war in Malta, he'd defused bombs, and he got a BEM as a corporal, you know. He became a very close friend. He was the only regular soldier I ever met during my army service who'd read the Communist Manifesto and understood it. Very interesting man. I very much like soldiers. I still do. I still feel very close to soldiers, you know, having been a national serviceman. Anyway, I came out at the end of May '49. I went to, what did I do?
What was it like being a communist in the army?
Well, it was interesting because by that, I mean, officially I wasn't. You know, I was interested in Marxism and I'd read quite a lot of Marxism. But when we were stationed at Drimmen, at Buchanan Castle, we used to go to Glasgow at the weekend, and I went to the party bookshop regularly. The Glasgow District Committee sort of accepted this somewhat reluctantly, but we couldn't do very much, obviously. It would have been stupid. Why we would have been RTU'd, we would have been returned to unit, because there was an anti-communist, strong anti-communist movement within army education at the time. So it was difficult, but on the other hand, I think I understood what I could sensibly do. All I could do in the teaching was to be fair and explain situations analytically, as it were. But being in Egypt, you see, the big question to the conscripts particularly was, why are we here? And we used to do classes on current political situation. So I used to say, well, we're here because of the history of the British involvement in Egypt and the Middle East and the Suez Canal and so on and so forth. And it was interesting, before the Major posted me down from Fayed to Suez, he said this, Alan, he said, Gathercole, I'm posting you down to Suez because you're obviously going to be capable of running this Army Education Centre. And we know about you, but I think it would be best to have you down there out of the way. Or words to that effect. Well, I remember thinking, you know, because I wasn't politically ignorant by that stage, having been a bit of a rebel at Clifton and mixing with people like Manifolds and so on, that, you know, that one could have a sensible political attitude of the left that made sense within the system. You did what you could. I mean, I realized immediately that Major Foreman, who was a hell of a nice man, actually, if he'd had any sense in this context, he would have said, well, we must keep you here because we have to keep our eye on you. But he trusted me, obviously, which was nice. And I never transgressed in that sense. You know, I never used, consciously anyway, my position as a WO2 to preach propaganda. What would be the point? Anyway, you didn't have to teach propaganda. What were the British doing in Egypt? They were guarding the Suez Canal. From whom? From the Russians, as much from the Americans as the Russians. We had a big military presence in the Middle East. Anyway, does that answer your question?
So the next stage was
Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Well, I got a job with this. I worked in the NUS before Cambridge.
National Union
Students in Ensley Street in Bloomsbury. I was in the vacation work department, and I allocated people to farm camps. And that was a good administrative experience, and it got me in touch with students. And there was a party cell there, a party group rather. I didn't realize this when I got the job. I wasn't appointed on that basis, I'm sure. But the communist students were pretty active in the NUS, obviously, and openly. The chap in charge of vacation work was Stan Levinson, who was a party member, who died quite recently. I happened to see a Morning Star a year ago, and I saw a brief notice. He'd had a lot of experience in the party during the war, one way or another. And I joined the YCL at Ilford, much to my parents' disgust.
Young Communist League.
Yeah. I did a bit. I wasn't terribly active. I had too much to do in the farm camps outfit and so on, and catching up on civilian life and reading and getting ready for Cambridge. And then I came up here and read history for 2 years. I read a prelim and part one, naturally, you might say, in Peterhouse. And of course, there were this marvellous group of dons who were very open, in my experience anyway. And that's where I met Jack Golson.
Do you want to say something about when we encounter people on your voyage? It's quite nice just to stop for a moment and say something about them. And he's one of the people, obviously, who has had a great influence, or at least you've worked with, and so on. Can you say anything about Jack and your relationship?
Yes, I wrote an article in the Festschrift for Jack Golson, which ANU published in '96, something like that. And my paper's the first one. I met him and Max Cole, also historians. We were all history scholars. Max, Alan I think was his real name, but he was always called Max. He and Jack had been up in the latter part of the war. They did a year and then were called up. Jack went into the pits as a Bevin boy. So did Max for a time, and then went into the Air Force. And they came back and finished their degrees. Well, they'd already formally taken their degrees, because you could do it after 6 terms, couldn't you, during the war. So I met them almost immediately when I came up, because I got involved with the undergraduate branch. There were 33 members, I remember. But Jack has had an enormous influence on me. I mean, he was not only a history scholar. By that stage he'd just finished, or was finishing, his Part 2, although he'd already taken a degree. And actually he'd already taken his MA, one of those anomalies of the post-war period. And he was beginning research in medieval archaeology, Lincolnshire deserted villages. And we spent a lot of time together. We used to sell daily workers together on Saturdays. That's all in this article. But he influenced me greatly, because he showed me the interconnections between Marxism, history and archaeology in a pragmatic sense. And he ultimately encouraged me to move from history to archaeology, because there were so many people reading history, and one felt, you just went along to Mill Lane and absorbed very good lectures, and I was doing medieval and a bit later in the main.
Was anyone particularly good?
Oh gosh, the chap who used to lecture on the papacy, a fellow at Trinity, I've forgotten his name. Brian Wormald was very helpful to me. He was my director of studies.
John Saltmarsh?
Yes, his lectures were fantastic. They really were. I understand he didn't publish a lot.
Hardly at all. Just one famous article on the plague in medieval.
Oh yes, but his lectures.
Was it true that he once impaled a student on the end of a board-pointing device when he was illustrating the effects of the stirrup on European civilization?
I don't know, but it's quite possible. That may be one of those yarns, I don't know. I went to Poston's lectures, the same lectures 2 years running, and they were different. I went because Max Cole, who was by that time a graduate student, said I should go. And I cared greatly for Peterhouse. It was a very small college. By contemporary terms, you would argue that it was effete, narrow. It was very liberal. It was much more liberal academically and politically than it was when I saw it again in the 70s. I was appalled by it when I came back, because they gave me some dining rights, and I used to go into dinner sometime. And the conversation was dreadful. Narrow, sectarian. The fellows who lived in college talked to each other and hardly talked to anyone else. David Clarke was the only exception, the archaeologist. I liked him enormously. I was terribly sad when he died.
Yes, I was going to ask you about him. He seemed absolutely outstanding.
Oh, he was. I didn't agree with a lot of his arguments about archaeology as a science, but I certainly agreed with his essential quantitative approach, with his work on the Bronze Age, with the support that he got from Graham Clark, and so on and so forth. But I'm jumping ahead a bit. Jack and I did a lot together, and politically and also academically in a sense, because in '53, I'm jumping ahead again. I moved over to archaeology to do a part 2, but they wouldn't give me a second year for my part 2, so I had to do it from scratch in 1 year, and that was tough. By that time I was married. I married Valmai, who'd read English at Bedford in London. She was in the party, and her family was militant Welsh working class. That was her background, although she was a Londoner. Near Cuffley she came from. Her father had a long history of militancy. He had been imprisoned in the First War as a conscientious objector, all that sort of thing. She came up to Cambridge at the end of my second year, because she was ahead of me, because I, had been in the army. And we married that summer, and we lived out. And I remember Dennis Mac-Smith, who was my tutor, saying to me, "Oh, that's good. That means you won't need any accommodation." And I said, "Well, Dennis, do I have to come into hall every night?" No, he said, no. But we'll have to get your wife to sign a bit of paper to say that you go home at midnight, by midnight every night. Valmai was furious. we lived in Romsey. And I worked very hard because I had to get something reasonable in that 1 year, you see, in a part 2. And I got a 2-1. I got a 2-1 in my part 1. In my prelim, my first year, I got a 2-2. And I went to see Dennis. He summoned me and he said, "Look, you're doing too much political work. You've got to concentrate more." I talked to Brian about it. And this is true, Alan. I then went to see Brian Wormold, who had been very nice to me. I went to his lectures on Clarendon, and they were fascinating. Brian used to tie himself into knots when he was lecturing, and you felt that he was always trying to solve insuperable problems as a historian. And he was very shy at one level. He used to sit like this, and he said to me, "Look," he said, "have you been to see Dennis?" I said, "Yes." By the way, Dennis had been at St Paul's Choir School as well, and at Clifton, strangely enough. And Brian said, "Well, you've been doing too much politics." He said, "If you get a 2-2, oh no, Dennis had said this to me, if you get a 2-2 for your part 1, we'll downgrade you to an exhibitioner." And the party branch committee were furious that I'd only got a 2-2. I'd been secretary, and we had to get a 2-1 or better in the party branch. There was that strong emphasis on being a good student. That was a strong line in the Cambridge branch. And Margot Heinman told me years later that had been true in the 30s as well. So Brian said, "I'm going to send you to Max Cole. He's going to supervise you. And he'll keep you on the straight and narrow." And there was a party member supervising another party member. This was Brian's deliberate policy, and it worked. I went to see Max, who was married to a well-known economist, Dorothy Wedderburn, as she became, who I've been friendly with for many years, and I've seen only recently, actually, a year or two ago, because she has links with Darwin. And Max said to me, "I've been talking to Brian, and you're going to work jolly hard, and the supervisions are going to be straight on the subject, and after that we can talk politics if you want to." And that worked. And I got a 2-1, and then I got an open scholarship, to my amazement, from Essex County Council, a county major, to go to the Institute of Archaeology. And that's where I came under the influence of Child and was taught by Child and so on. At Cambridge, I'd been taught mainly by Graham Clark, who was a fellow of Peterhouse by that stage, and of course Glyn Daniel, and I went to part 1 lectures as well, as far as possible, to get background as well as part 2. And De Navarro in Trinity, his Bronze Age lectures were fascinating, extraordinary.
Did you go to any anthropology lectures?
No, I didn't have time. No, that's not quite true. I did go to a few. Cliff Slaughter was here then. There were quite a lot of left-wingers and party members in Arcanance.
Was Rio Fortune there?
Yes, but I'd never met him at that stage. because I didn't have time to go to anthropology lectures, you see. I wanted to. Cliff influenced me a lot. He subsequently worked on Coal is Your Life or something like that. He went to Leeds, I think. There were one or two. There was a chap called Ray also, whose mother was active in the party in Cambridge. And of course there was Jack around, although he was doing field work a lot. We had a group. Yes. And then there was a very nice woman, very nice girl called Alice.
Jack Goody. When you say Jack?
No, Golson.
Oh, Jack Golson.
I didn't know Jack Goody at that stage. I mean, he was around, yes, but I didn't know any of these people, you know. There was a woman called Alison. No, she married a research student in Trinity, American, who was working on the history of science, called Ravitz. Yes, she became Alison Ravitz. She was a party member, and she went to the Institute at the same time as I did. I think she's now Emeritus Professor of Social Policy at Leeds Metropolitan or something like that. So there was a group of us, and we met occasionally. You see, the party branch at Cambridge, the undergraduate branch, was not just organised as a branch, but it was also organised into academic groups. And there were some very bright people, including Moet Sen, who was in King's, and John Prime, who was also in King's. They both got firsts. Bunny Leff, whom you probably know or know of, a medievalist. Yes. Gordon Leff. Yeah.
Was Eric Hobsbawm?
Well, we went. The party always encouraged all the undergraduate in the student branch, whatever subject, were encouraged to go to Eric's lectures. And I remember going. You know, there were scientists there and members of the Socialist Club and so on. I mean, we were very active.
Were they very good lectures?
Yes. He lectured on labour history about from 1850 or something like that. They were very good lectures. I was very impressed. But I wasn't impressed just by the left-wingers. I mean, there were some very, very good lectures in my experience there. Here, in Arkananth it was a different story in the sense that it was much smaller. And the lectures were more informal. You didn't wear gowns, for example. At least as far as I remember. I don't think I ever wore a gown going to Arkananth lectures. I didn't know the museum collections at that stage. I wasn't really very interested in the museum. There wasn't time. I went to some lectures on technology that Geoffrey Bushnell gave, I mean, out of interest as far as I could fit them in. But mainly I was concentrating, obviously, on the textbooks and the literature, because I had to take this part too. And I tell you who I met at a college dinner, at a college feast. I met Tawney.
Did you? Gosh, tell me something about Tawney.
Well, he was an honorary fellow.
Yes. Because
LSE had been evacuated to Peterhouse in the war. And he was invited, of course, to this feast, which was for fellows and scholars. What I want to stress is that Peterhouse was liberal and open, and you met fellows. You know, David Knowles was a lovely man. Brogan was fascinating, would talk non-stop at you. I liked it very much, the intellectual atmosphere, and they put me next to Tawney. I'm sure that was deliberate. And Tawney said to me, "What are you reading, lad?" And I said, "I'm reading archaeology." He said, "Oh, I live in the Cotswolds." And he talked about Neolithic sites. Betty Heckler's Tump, something like that. I mean, I may have got the title wrong. And he knew quite a lot about archaeology. Now, we had done Religion and the Rise of Capitalism at school. I still got my Pelican with the marks, you know. And I told him this. And he was pleased. I'm sure he was pleased. And then he said to me, "What sort of class do you think you're going to get?" So I said, "Well, I'd like to get a 2-1, if I can." And he said, "Well, don't worry," he said, "I got a 3rd. Actually, he didn't.
No, he got a 2-1.
He didn't get a 2-1. They hadn't They didn't divide the second class at Oxford in his day.
Yeah.
But I remember this, he did say to me, don't worry, I got a third. And of course, from Oxford, from Balliol, he went to Manchester, didn't he, and started working in adult education. But he was such a nice man. I mean, he encouraged people, you know, he opened people out. I remember this conversation. Perhaps I'm idealising it, but he was so nice.
Mm.
And of course, I read a lot of Tawney after that, you know, the Acquisitive Society and so on. Anyway, I went to the Institute. Valmay went teaching. We lived in one room in Hackney. And she became pregnant. And our eldest son was born in 53. That's right, he'll be 50 this year. And it was tough, but it was manageable. And I did a full-time course for 2 years. I read a lot of Child, obviously. I didn't have any intention at that stage in writing about him. I was fascinated by his Marxism, of course, which I felt was limited, but I couldn't work it out because archaeological data, as I saw it, was limited. I mean, how do you talk about ideology when you're essentially concerned with material culture? Well, these were issues that archaeologists have taken up subsequently. But at that time, there was much emphasis on stratigraphy, chronology, and typology. Perfectly understandable. What I felt I didn't know was the social context of stuff. And I realized that I should have done some anthropology somewhere along the line. Also, because I had read Marx and Engels within limits, obviously, I was always interested in the philosophical context and social context, but I'd never done any philosophy. That interest and knowledge really came much later. Anyway, I did the course. I didn't get a distinction. I'd been very active in the student peace movement in London, which wasn't a good thing, actually, because we were living with very little money, and then Jonathan was born in the November of 53, and so, you know, it was a struggle. And Piddock, who was the secretary at the Institute, said to me as I was finishing, he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to do some research, actually." He said, "You can't do research, you must get a job. You've got a wife and son." He said, "There's a job going at Birmingham." Now, during the vacations, I'd excavated for the Ministry of Works, and I excavated with Jack Golson at Norwich in 53, where he and John Hurst had dug 2 years previously. And we did a medieval into earlier excavation across the town wall there, parallel to one he had done with John Hurst in 51. And I learned a great deal of field archaeology there. And Jack and I kept in touch, you know, when we weren't actually working together. I remember when I was doing a rescue dig at Oakham in 53, he came across from Lincolnshire and visited the site at Oakham. That was the first piece of field work I'd done. And we spread out the pottery in the hotel on the floor that night, because I didn't know anything about medieval pottery, you know, I had to learn from scratch. And he had done a lot of work on medieval pottery, and later. Anyway, I got the job at Birmingham. I was digging at Oakham, the second dig, a controlled dig, and I got a day off and went for the interview. And I got the job, and I went there in the October and worked in the Department of Archaeology, Ethnography and Local History with Adrian Oswald, who was the keeper. And then I had to lecture on the collections as a trainee assistant, including ethnography. So I started to read ethnography. I went to an extramural class as a student, and I read Patterns of Culture. And that's where I read about Fortune's work, of course, because that chapter on Dobu, you know, by Benedict, and of course the Northwest Coast and all that sort of stuff. And I found it fascinating. But I had to lecture on ethnographic collections, you see. I remember I gave a lecture on the Maori, and I still got the notes. It was awful, awful.
Your lecture was awful.
No, the notes, I mean, tell me that I obviously knew very little. You know, I'd cobbled it together. And before I'd finished my 2 years, because it was only a 2-year appointment, 300 a year, 295 a year it was, I got the curatorship at Scunthorpe. And that was fascinating. Now, it was interesting being in the party, because I went to the district committee in Birmingham and I said, what shall I do? And they said, be a good curator. Work in local government, you know. Be open. I'm sure Adrian knew my politics and so on, but don't be dogmatic, don't preach. You know, you've got an important job to do as a curator in this whole Marxist tradition of the understanding of culture. In effect, that's what they were saying to me. So Valmar used to do various things in the normal sort of party branch manner. I'd done a daily work around when I was a student here, regularly on a Saturday, and I did a little bit of that in Birmingham. But I was so busy because I had to earn extra money. You know, I did extramural teaching in the evening. Graham Webster, who was an RB man, a Romano-British man in the university, he encouraged me. I worked hard there. One had to. We had the second child born in Birmingham, Nicholas. So when I went to Scunthorpe on 660 a year, into a council house at a very good rent, there we were with 2 small children, and a museum that had enormous potential. And what was Scunthorpe? It was a bit of Sheffield moved into North Lincolnshire. It was very prosperous. All the council except one member were Labour, and they were keen on culture. And I was the first, well, there'd been a full-time curator who had previously been part-time, a chap called Dudley, who had done a hell of a lot of work over many years. And he had built up the museum from 1919 or thereabouts. I think he became a full-time curator in 1939. And it was in the old vicarage in Scunthorpe. Well, it's a Victorian building. But there was great scope there, and I loved it. It was very interesting. I got a car eventually, an old Austin 7, pre-war Austin 7, and I had contacts in 24 villages, you know, because we had to watch sites. You know, they didn't have the same structure as they have now with county archaeology groups and things like that. I was doing a lot of field work, in a way, as well as developing the museum, and the total budget was £3,000. I had an assistant curator and a typist and a custodian who lived on the premises. Well, Jack had gone to New Zealand in late '53, the first full-time archaeologist appointed, prehistorian, appointed to a university department in New Zealand.
Otago?
No, Auckland. Piddington had started the department there in 1950. Initially he went for social anthropologists, and also Biggs, who, I think Biggs was appointed then. Biggs was a Maori linguist, a very distinguished man, very distinguished, very nice man. Got to know him well eventually. He died a few years ago, sadly. Otago was very different. Skinner had been appointed in 1919, 1920 to a joint appointment, lecturer in ethnology in the university, a one-year course that he never developed beyond that, and also assistant curatorship in the Otago Museum. And eventually he became director, and he retired in '53 but stayed on for another year, and then Derek Freeman got appointed for 1 year. Derek, of course, was a New Zealander, and he had already, you know, a developing career. I think Leach had been responsible for him working in Sarawak, etc., etc. Derek went to the ANU, not surprisingly, so they had to decide what to do about this. Were they going to have somebody appointed to this post? The director was a chap called Forster, who had replaced Skinner, and he was a spider-man, a specialist in spiders, you know, entomologist. Yeah. He was very good. at that level. He was a good director. They had to decide what to do, and eventually they reconstituted this joint appointment in '57. And Jack wrote to me, I've still got the letter, saying, would you be interested? Because I know you've been teaching yourself anthropology and you've got a wide, you've got a wide range of interest and you've had this museum experience and so on. There's in a place called Dunedin in the South Island, or words to that effect. And so Valma and I discussed it, and it was a difficult decision to make because I was going to stay at Scunthorpe for 5 years or something like that and build it up, which subsequently happened, of course. It became a very good museum, and I was very interested in the museum development in the whole area. Doncaster, Sheffield, Hull, had good contacts with Hull, a very good museum there, I thought. But I applied. I was interviewed by a historian, a professor of history from Otago who was on leave in London at the time, and the Secretary General of the Association of Commonwealth Universities, a chap called Foster, who it turned out was a distant relative of mine, way back, because Gathercoles had gone to Melbourne in the 1850s, and his mother had been a Gathercole. Quite extraordinary. Anyway, William Morrill was the professor of history, and he was on leave, that's right. He was a UCL man, Pacific historian, nice man, very interesting man. And I got the job, to my amazement. So after much thought, I accepted the job, but not immediately, because it meant uprooting ourselves. We were going to be emigrants, And we went with 2 little boys by ship. 6 weeks it took. And of course it was all new to me. And that's where the whole New Zealand career began. This joint appointment at Otago. I don't know whether you want me to talk about that.
We've got 4 minutes left on this tape. Would you like to ask a question about New Zealand?
Well, when you first arrived, Skinner was still around, wasn't he?
Very much.
Right.
Yes. Now this was very important. In fact, the whole link with Skinner was crucial, because not only was he a very distinguished ethnologist in that Haddon, Rivers, etc. tradition, but also he was much committed to New Zealand. His grandparents had emigrated from Plymouth, that area, to New Plymouth. Very significant migration in the 1840s, establishing New Plymouth really. His father, W.H. Skinner, was born in Taranaki and was a surveyor. And he was very interested in Maori objects, and Skinner grew up in that environment. He couldn't do any anthropology in New Zealand as a student. I remember he went down to Otago to finish his degree just before the First War, and he did classics and zoology, which was a very sensible combination, actually. It was the closest he could get to anthropology, he told me. Then, of course, he volunteered, and he was at Gallipoli and wounded. He was in the Otago regiment. Survived, but it was tough, I think. He was awarded a DCM. This was in 1915-16, before the military medal was instituted, or just around the same time. The Distinguished Conduct Medal is, the non-officer's equivalent to a DSO. So he'd obviously done some pretty brave things, and he was invalided out. And what did he do? He came to Cambridge and read the diploma. I mean, Haddon welcomed him.
Diploma in ethnology?
In anthropology. There were several diplomas then. It was before they taught an undergraduate degree properly, as you know. And he loved it. He was in Christ's. And of course, he had everybody, because there were very few students. I mean, I remember he told me he went to, I think Duckworth was around. He went to Duckworth lectures, and he said, Peter, first there were 6 of us, or something like that. Then there were 5, then there were 4, then there were 3, then there were 2, then there was me. And he took the diploma. Von Hugel was his director of studies. And von Hugel said, would you like to work on the Moriori stuff? And that was the beginning of Skinner's dissertation on the Moriori, which later became a Bishop Museum monograph. He hadn't been to the Chathams by that stage, but he went subsequently. They went back to New Zealand at the end of the war by ship. He was going to take a job at the Dominion Museum, as it was in Wellington, or perhaps it was the Colonial Museum still, but anyway, in Wellington. But suddenly there came this offer for this job in Dunedin, financed by Willy Fels, who was a local German origin businessman, very successful, very liberal-minded, socially conscious businessman. Dunedin was the biggest and most prosperous city in New Zealand in the late 19th century. And the museum had been established in 1868, the university in 1869. It had quite a respectable history in that sense, but very little ethnology until the just before the First World War. For various reasons, they started to get significant collections. Skinner went in and built it up.